A crowded courtroom in downtown Los Angeles. Expensive suits, whispers of judgment, and a thick layer of arrogance in the air. At the center of the room stands a man, alone, a worn shirt, a calm face, and tired eyes. This is Daniel Hayes, a 41-year-old single dad. The opposing counsel smirks. You expect this court to believe you have the means to provide for a child? A wave of quiet laughter ripples through the room. Daniel says nothing, just stands there, holding a small file. The judge asks, "Do you have any final evidence?" Daniel looks up slowly, and everything changes. The game is finally over. The courtroom was a theater of status, and today, Daniel Hayes was the easiest target in the room. He sat at the wooden table, his shoulders square, but his clothes telling a story of struggle. His shirt was clean but frayed at the collar. His shoes were polished but worn thin at the soles. To the high-powered lawyers across the aisle, he was a nobody, a flickering candle in a room full of spotlights. Daniel was a 41-year-old single father, a man whose entire universe was contained within the small, hopeful smile of his 9-year-old daughter, Lily. Lily sat in the back row, her small hands gripping the edge of the bench, her eyes never leaving her father. She was the reason he was here, and she was the reason he had endured months of silent insults and systemic bullying. Daniel lived a life that most would call modest. He drove an old sedan that rattled in the wind. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment near the outskirts of the city, and he worked long hours in a job that didn't seem to offer much of a future. He kept a low profile, avoiding the glitz and glamour of the city, focusing entirely on Lily's education and her happiness. But today, that modesty was being used as a weapon against him. This wasn't just a legal hearing, it was a character assassination. The case involved a complex custody dispute and a series of financial accusations aimed at proving Daniel was an unfit father because he lacked resources. The opposing party was powerful, wealthy, and deeply connected to the city's elite. They arrived with a fleet of black SUVs and a legal team that cost more per hour than Daniel supposedly made in a month. The dynamics of the courtroom were clear from the moment the session began. Daniel was the underdog, the man no one took seriously. He was seen as weak because he didn't raise his voice. He was seen as lacking because he didn't flash a diamond watch or a designer tie. The spectators in the gallery whispered behind their hands, judging his appearance, mocking his silence. They saw a man who was out of his league, a man who was about to lose the only thing that mattered to him to a system that worshipped the dollar. The opposing lawyer, a sharp-tongued man named Marcus Thorne, was aggressive and dismissive. He paced the floor like a predator, his voice dripping with a confident disdain that filled the room like a poisonous gas. "Your Honor," Thorne began, his voice echoing off the marble walls with a practiced resonance. "We are here to discuss the welfare of a child who deserves stability, a child who deserves the best that life can offer. And yet, we have a father who can barely provide the basics. Look at him. Does this look like a man who can secure a future for a young girl? Or does this look like a man who is one missed paycheck away from the street?" Thorne turned and looked directly at Daniel, a predatory smirk playing on his lips. He wanted Daniel to crack. He wanted him to beg. He wanted a reaction he could use to prove his point. But Daniel remained still, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on the judge with a calm that was almost unnerving. The judge, a woman known for her cold efficiency and her intolerance for time wasting, watched the proceedings with a detached interest. She saw the disparity in the room, the overwhelming force of Thorne's legal machine compared to Daniel's solitary presence. She looked at Lily, who was watching her father with a desperate kind of hope that was painful to witness. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the cold smell of old paper. Daniel's silence wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a man who was waiting for the right moment. He knew that in this room, truth was often buried under the weight of gold. He knew that they laughed at him because they only understood what they could see on the surface. They didn't see the man who stayed up until 2 a.m. helping Lily with her math homework. They didn't see the man who walked 5 miles in the rain because he spent his gas money on her new violin strings. They didn't see the man who told her stories of dragons and stars to make her forget they were eating canned soup for the third night in a row. They only saw the worn shirt, and in their world, the shirt was the man. Thorne continued his assault, presenting fabricated charts of Daniel's debt and instability. Every word was a needle. Every slide was a blade. The gallery chuckled at Thorne's wit, enjoying the spectacle of a common man being dismantled by a master of the craft. Lily looked down at her shoes, her small shoulders shaking as the pressure of the room began to crush her spirit. Daniel felt a surge of protectiveness, a fire in his chest that he kept tightly locked away for her sake. He looked at his daughter, and for a split second, he gave her a tiny, barely perceptible nod. "Hold on, Lily," his eyes said. "The truth is coming. It just needs the right stage." The lawyers laughed. The observers whispered. But the man at the center of the storm simply tightened his grip on the small, tattered file in his lap. The first act of the play was almost over, and the audience had no idea that the lead actor was about to change the script entirely. 5. As the morning session dragged on, the weight of the accusations began to feel physical, like a heavy fog pressing down on the room. Daniel sat through hour after hour of unfair testimony and twisted truths. He was accused of being financially irresponsible, of being a man who couldn't offer a standard of living appropriate for a child of Lily's potential. They painted a picture of a man who was drowning in a sea of his own making, a man who was a burden to the very child he claimed to love. The pressure was immense. Most men would have broken. Most would have shouted at the lies or wept in frustration. But Daniel knew that anger was exactly what they wanted. They wanted to prove he was unstable and emotional. So he remained a rock in the middle of their tide, absorbing every blow with a silence that began to disturb Thorne. The truth was far more complex than anyone in that room could imagine. Daniel hadn't been avoiding the fight. He had been protecting a legacy and a promise. 10 years ago, when his wife was still alive, they had made a choice. They had seen the way extreme wealth could rot a person's soul from the inside out, how it could turn family members into rivals and love into a mere transaction. She wanted Lily to know the value of a dollar earned, the weight of a promise kept, and the beauty of a life lived for something more than a bank balance. For years, he had lived this quiet life to shield Lily from the toxic environment of the world he had once belonged to. He had deliberately kept his distance from his true identity, avoiding exposing the deeper issues of his past to keep her childhood pure. He didn't fight aggressively because he didn't want to become the monster Thorne already claimed he was. But Thorne was relentless and lacked any sense of boundaries. He escalated the attack, moving from financial accusations to personal embarrassments. He brought up Daniel's cheap apartment, mocking the neighborhood, describing it as a den of mediocrity where dreams went to die. He spoke about the pathetic vacations Daniel took with Lily, camping trips in the mountains instead of five-star resorts in the Maldives. "Does a child not deserve to see the world from a balcony rather than a tent in the mud?" Thorne asked the court, drawing another round of snickers from the gallery. Daniel looked down at his hands, his knuckles white. He remembered the way Lily's eyes lit up when they saw the Milky Way from that tent. He remembered the way she laughed as they roasted marshmallows over a fire they built together. To Thorne, it was poverty. To Daniel, it was everything. It was the only thing that was real. "You don't have the means to provide, Mr. Hayes," Thorne said, leaning over Daniel's table, his breath smelling of expensive coffee and arrogance. "Admit it. You are a failure of a provider. You are a man who has nothing to offer but a worn-out dream and a collection of excuses." The laughter in the courtroom spread like a slow-moving wave, drowning out the dignity of the room. Even the bailiff seemed to look at Daniel with a pitying gaze, as if he were watching a condemned man. The judge cleared her throat, the sound sharp and final in the echoing room. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice echoing Thorne's skepticism with a cold clarity. "The court is seeing a very one-sided picture here. Do you have anything to say? Any proof that you can offer this child a future that isn't defined by, well, by this?" She gestured vaguely at his appearance, her eyes scanning his worn clothes. Daniel looked up. He didn't look at the judge first. He looked at Lily. She was crying now, silent tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. She looked so small and fragile in that large, cold room. She looked like she was losing her world, her father, and her hope all at once. Daniel felt the weight of the secret he had carried for 10 years, the weight of the billions he had kept in the shadows to give his daughter a real childhood. He had hoped it would never come to this. He had hoped they would see him for who he was as a father, not for what he had in a vault. He had hoped the system would value the man who stayed up at night over the man who signed the checks. But the world wasn't designed to see the heart. It was designed to see the gold. And if they wanted gold, he was about to give them an avalanche that would bury them all. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. The courtroom went quiet, not out of respect, but out of a cruel curiosity to see how he would stumble over his final words. Thorne leaned back against his table, crossing his arms, a look of smug victory on his face. He thought the kill was coming. He thought the man in the worn shirt was about to give up and sign away his rights. Daniel reached for the small, tattered file he had been holding. It wasn't full of legal arguments. It wasn't full of pleas for mercy or character references. It was full of the one thing that this room worshipped above all else. "Your Honor," Daniel began, his voice surprisingly clear, devoid of the tremor everyone expected. "I have spent 10 years trying to prove that a man is not defined by the clothes he wears or the car he drives. I have spent 10 years trying to show my daughter that character is the only currency that truly matters in the end." He paused, looking at Thorne, then at the gallery. "But I realize now that in this room, character is invisible. You don't see a father. You see a bank statement. You don't see a life. You see a balance sheet." He took a breath, the silence in the room becoming deafening. "If this court needs proof of my means, if you need to see the standard I can provide, then let us stop talking about what I lack. And let us start talking about what I have been hiding to keep my daughter's heart safe." He reached into the file and pulled out a single black card and a small encrypted mobile device. The atmosphere shifted instantly. It was like a sudden drop in temperature. Daniel wasn't looking down anymore. He was looking through them. The judge leaned forward, her brow furrowed as she peered over her glasses. "Mr. Hayes, what exactly is that?" Thorne scoffed, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "More desperate theater, Your Honor. Probably a library card from a neighborhood he can't even afford." Daniel didn't respond to the taunt. He simply placed the black card on the table and tapped the device in his hand. "Do you have any evidence to support your claim of financial stability, Mr. Hayes?" the judge repeated, her patience wearing thin. Daniel paused, a long, calculated pause that seemed to stretch the very air in the room. He didn't reach for a stack of bank statements. He didn't show a paycheck. Instead, he made a single 10-second phone call. "It's time," he said, and hung up. The courtroom doors at the back of the room suddenly swung open with a sound like a thunderclap. Every head turned. 4 men and 3 women entered the room. They weren't dressed like the local lawyers. They were dressed like the people who own the world. They moved with a quiet, terrifying authority that made Thorne's legal team look like children playing dress-up in their parents' clothes. At the front was a woman in a sharp gray suit, Elizabeth Vance, the most feared corporate attorney in the country. She didn't look at the gallery. She didn't look at Thorne. She walked straight to Daniel's side and bowed her head slightly. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the room like a bell. "The accounts have been unfrozen. The documentation is ready for the court's review." The entire room froze. The murmurs died in people's throats. Thorne's face went from smug to ghostly pale in a matter of seconds. He knew that face. He knew that firm. They didn't represent modest fathers in custody battles. They represented sovereign wealth funds. They represented the architects of the global economy. Elizabeth Vance turned to the judge and placed a heavy, leather-bound portfolio on the bench. "Your Honor," she said, her voice like cold silk, "my name is Elizabeth Vance of Vance & Associates. I am here to represent the interests of Daniel Hayes, the majority shareholder and founder of the Hayes Global Group." A gasp, audible and sharp, ripped through the courtroom. The Hayes Global Group. They were the invisible hand behind half the skyline of Los Angeles. They were a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that operated with a legendary level of anonymity. The judge's hands trembled as she opened the portfolio. She flipped through the pages, not of debts or missed payments, but of assets that boggled the mind. Real estate in 4 continents, tech patents that powered every phone in the room, cash reserves that could buy the very building they were sitting in 10 times over without a second thought. "Mr. Hayes," the judge whispered, her eyes wide as she looked at the man in the worn shirt. All of this is you?" Daniel stood tall now, his presence filling the room in a way it hadn't before. He wasn't the underdog anymore. He was the titan they had been mocking for 3 hours. The same people who had laughed, the same observers who had whispered "loser," were now frozen in a state of absolute, crushing silence. The shift in power was so violent it was almost physical. Thorne tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. This must be a mistake. This man, he lives in a rental. He drives a 10-year-old car. It's a scam." Daniel looked at Thorne with a cold, steady pity that was more devastating than any insult. "I live there because I wanted my daughter to grow up in a home, not a museum," Daniel said, his voice resonating with a power that made the walls vibrate. "I drive that car because it gets us where we need to go without screaming for attention. I didn't want her to think life was about the car you drive. I wanted her to think it was about where you were going." He turned back to the judge. "I didn't disclose this earlier because I wanted this court to see the truth of my character. I wanted to see if justice in this city could see a father for his heart, or if it only has eyes for his wallet. I got my answer today." The truth was now laid bare. Daniel wasn't just stable. He was a billionaire who had spent a decade operating through shell companies and anonymous trusts to live a quiet, intentional life. He had built an empire from nothing, and then stepped away from the spotlight to raise Lily with the values his own parents had taught him. Values that didn't include arrogance, greed, or the need to look down on others. The legal representatives at his side began presenting the real financial records. The trusts set up in Lily's name, the charitable foundations Daniel had quietly funded for years to help families exactly like the one Thorne claimed he was. Every document was a hammer blow to Thorne's case. The evidence Thorne had presented was revealed to be nothing more than a shallow, pathetic misunderstanding of a man who chose not to flaunt what he owned. The room was no longer a courtroom. It was a sanctuary of realization. The silence was heavy with the weight of 1,000 apologies that would never be spoken. The judge looked at Daniel, her expression shifting from skepticism to a profound, rare respect. She looked at Lily, who was standing up now, her eyes wide, not with the shock of money, but with the realization that her father had been a warrior for her all along. The man who fixed her toys with duct tape, the man who walked her to school every morning, was the same man who held the keys to a kingdom. But to Lily, he was still just dad. And that, Daniel realized, was his greatest achievement. He had succeeded in hiding the billionaire, but he had failed to hide the hero. The same man who roasted marshmallows was the man who could buy the mountain, but he preferred the marshmallows. The judge sat back, the leather-bound portfolio still open before her like a map of a different world. The silence in the room was no longer tense. It was reflective, almost holy. She looked at Daniel, really looked at him this time, seeing past the frayed collar and the worn shoes. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice softer than it had been all morning, "this court is stunned. You have resources that exceed almost any individual who has ever stood in this room. Why was this not disclosed earlier? You could have ended this case in 5 minutes. You could have crushed the opposing counsel with a single phone call months ago. Why endure the mockery? Why let them laugh at you while your heart was on the line?" Daniel took a slow, deep breath, his hand resting on the table. "Because, Your Honor," he began, "this case wasn't about proving what I have. It was about proving who I am. I grew up seeing how wealth can become a cage. I saw people who were valued for their net worth and ignored for their character. When Lily was born, I made a promise to her and to myself. I promised she would grow up knowing that a person's worth is measured by their kindness, their resilience, and their word. I wanted her to see me as a man who works hard, who cares for his neighbors, and who stands up for what's right, not because he has the money to buy his way out, but because he has the soul to face it. He paused, a faint smile touching his lips as he glanced at Lily. I chose a simple life. I chose the rental apartment and the old car because they were real. They didn't come with strings attached. I wanted to keep things real for her. I wanted her to know that happiness isn't something you buy. It's something you build with the people you love. If I had walked in here on day one and flashed my billions, I wouldn't have been a father seeking justice. I would have been a rich man buying it. And that is a lesson I never want my daughter to learn. I wanted her to see that her father could stand alone against the world, and that was enough. The emotional shift in the room was palpable. The judgment that had been directed at him like a storm had turned into a profound, hushed respect. Even Thorne sat slumped in his chair, the fire gone from his eyes. He had tried to mock a man for being small, only to realize he had been barking at a mountain. Daniel's words didn't just defend his case, they defended a way of life that the modern world had almost forgotten in its rush for status. He proved that the man in the worn shirt was the same man who owned the tower, and that the shirt was the more important part of the story. If who you are matters more than what you have, type, I stand by that. The ruling was swift and absolute. The judge didn't even need a recess to deliberate. She closed the portfolio with a firm click that echoed like a final verdict. The court finds in favor of Daniel Hayes, she announced, her voice clear and authoritative. The accusations of financial instability are not only dismissed, they are found to be dangerously close to malicious and founded on pure prejudice. Mr. Hayes has proven, in more ways than one, that he is not only a fit provider, but a father of exceptional character and integrity. Custody is secured. This case is closed. The room erupted into a different kind of noise. Not laughter, but a stunned, respectful chatter. Thorne and his team gathered their papers in a hurried, humiliated silence, disappearing through the side exit before the cameras could find them and record their defeat. Daniel didn't look at them. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need a victory lap. He simply looked toward the back row where his whole world waited. Lily was already running. She sprinted down the center aisle, her hair flying behind her, and threw herself into his arms with a force that nearly knocked him over. Daniel knelt down, catching her in a hug that seemed to shut out the rest of the world. "Is it over, Dad?" she whispered into his shoulder, her voice still shaky from the tears. "It's over, Lily," he said, kissing the top of her head. "Everything's okay. We're going home." "To our apartment?" she asked, pulling back to look at him with those big, honest eyes. Daniel smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes and lit up his tired face. "To our apartment. And we're still building that bridge for your science project tonight, just like we planned." The courtroom emptied slowly, the spectators walking out with a strange sense of quiet, as if they had just witnessed a miracle. Daniel walked out last, holding Lily's hand tightly. He still wore the same worn shirt. He still had the same calm, unassuming presence. There were no limousines waiting for him at the curb, no flash bulbs, no celebration. He walked to his old sedan, buckled Lily into her seat, and drove away into the Los Angeles traffic. He was a billionaire who had just won a war, but as he turned on the radio to play Lily's favorite song, he was just a dad going home. They laughed at what they could see, because they lived in a world that only values the surface. They judged what they understood, because they couldn't imagine a man who didn't need to brag. But sometimes, the truth doesn't need to speak loudly. It doesn't need to wear a suit or carry a title. It just needs the right moment to be seen for what it truly is. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more tales of hidden heroes, and tell me in the comments, would you have judged him too, or would you have seen the man behind the shirt?